I am recording this because no one believed me. Because the 7 of us who survived came home to a council chamber full of admirals who looked at us like we were broken, and maybe we were, but not in the way they thought. They believed we were cowards. They believed we had lost our nerve. 3 warships against a single cargo hauler, and only 7 bodies returned upright. The math did not make sense to them, and I understood why. Because it would not have made sense to me either if I had not been there. But I was there. I saw what happened. And I need someone, anyone, to understand what we encountered in the Argent Corridor. Because if we do not learn from what happened to us, the next crew will not have 7 survivors. They will have none. My name is Virath Cole. I held the rank of sub-commander aboard the Talon of Keth, flagship of a Vakari raiding flotilla, under the command of Fleet Commander Soreth Vel. If you are Vakari, you know that name. Soreth Vel, the conqueror of the Dothani supply lines. Soreth Vel, who brought the Alari merchant guilds to their knees in a single campaign season. He had more confirmed victories than any living commander in the Dominion, and his name was spoken in the war academies with the kind of reverence reserved for those who have reshaped the boundaries of our territory. He was the finest tactical mind our species had produced in 2 generations, and he died on the bridge of his own ship, with a look on his face that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was not anger, it was not defiance, it was confusion. Pure, absolute confusion, as if the universe had broken its own rules and he could not figure out how. I need to take you back to where it started. 3 days before the engagement, our flotilla was holding position near the outer boundary of the Argent Corridor, a stretch of unclaimed space between Vakari territory and the trade lanes used by half a dozen species. It was ideal hunting ground. No patrols, no jurisdiction, no witnesses. The corridor was a gap in the galaxy's attention, a place where signals went unmonitored, and distress calls could go unanswered for days. We had been running raids in that corridor for the better part of a cycle, picking off merchant convoys from the Mekt and the Alari, species that understood the transaction we offered. You see our cannons, you power down, you hand over your cargo, and you go home alive. Simple, clean, efficient. The galaxy had always worked that way, and every species we had ever encountered had confirmed it by folding the moment our weapons locked onto their hulls. The Vakari Dominion had built its prosperity on this principle for over 300 cycles. Our shipyards produced faster, deadlier vessels every year. Our officers trained in academies that taught a single, unwavering philosophy. Dominance is earned through force, and those who cannot defend what they have do not deserve to keep it. It was not cruelty. It was the natural order, or so we told ourselves. And we had no reason to question it, because every encounter, every raid, every confrontation had ended the same way. We arrived with superior numbers and superior firepower. The target assessed the situation, and the target surrendered. It was as reliable as gravity. Our long-range sensors picked up the target at the beginning of the third watch. A single vessel, large, moving through the corridor on a steady heading at moderate speed. No escort, no convoy. Just one ship, alone in the dark, following a trade route that we had been shadowing for days. Our scanner officer, a young male named Drevin, pulled up the signature profile and matched it against our database. The vessel was registered as a human cargo hauler, commercial class, designated the Stellan March. It was enormous, easily twice the mass of our largest warship, but scanners showed a power output consistent with a standard freight engine. No weapon signatures, no military transponder codes, no escort drones, no picket ships, no defensive screens. Just a big, slow, ugly box drifting through space, with whatever cargo humans thought was worth shipping across the black. We had been hunting for 3 days without a target, and patience was wearing thin. The crew was restless. Supplies were not low, but they were not abundant either, and a successful raid would mean fresh cargo and a return to Vicari space with something to show the Admiralty. A cargo hauler was exactly what we needed. Sorath Vel pulled up the tactical display and studied the vessel for perhaps 30 seconds before he smiled. And when Sorath smiled, it meant he had already won the engagement in his head, and the rest was formality. I had seen that smile before every successful raid we had conducted in the past 2 cycles. It had never been wrong. He opened a broadband communication channel. His voice carried the weight of a commander who had delivered the same words 100 times before, and had never once been refused. He identified our flotilla, 3 warships, the Talon of Keth, the Dread Silence, and the Burning Wake. Combined armament of over 60 weapons systems. He instructed the human vessel to cut its engines, power down its systems, and prepare for boarding. Compliance would be met with restraint. Resistance would be met with the full force of our combined arsenal. He gave them 60 ticks to respond. The channel stayed open. The silence stretched. On the bridge, no one was concerned. This was normal. The first few seconds after an ultimatum were always quiet. The silence would break, and a trembling voice would agree to our terms, and we would board their ship, take what we wanted, and leave them drifting. It was routine as docking procedures and shift changes, and the taste of the protein rations they served in the officers' mess. But the silence went on too long. I watched the chronometer on my console. 10 ticks, 20, 30. Sorath's smile faded by a degree, replaced by the expression he wore when something was not proceeding according to his expectations. He leaned forward in his command chair and repeated the ultimatum, sharper this time, with an edge that made it clear this was not a negotiation. He told the human ship that their window for cooperation was closing, and that the consequences of non-compliance would be demonstrated, not described. Not frightened calm, not the forced steadiness of someone trying to maintain composure under pressure. Genuinely calm, the way you might sound if someone interrupted you during a meal with a question that was not worth standing up for. She identified herself as Commander Grace Harlow of the Stellan March. She did not repeat our terms back to us. She did not ask for clarification. She did not plead or bargain or buy time. She said 4 words in that maddeningly relaxed tone, and those 4 words were the first crack in everything I thought I understood about the way the galaxy worked. She said, "You sure about that?" I looked at Sorath. He looked at me. Around the bridge, officers exchanged glances. With begging, yes. With surrender, always. With silence, occasionally, from those too frightened to speak. But never with a question, and certainly never with one delivered in a tone that suggested we were the ones who should be reconsidering our position. Sorath did not laugh. I noticed that. A warning from a part of my brain older than language, older than reason, a part that recognized the shape of danger, even when the conscious mind could not see it. Sorath opened the channel again. He told the human commander that she had 30 ticks remaining, and that the consequences of non-compliance would be immediate and severe. The channel went quiet again, but this time, the silence was different. It was not the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of someone who had already made their decision and was simply waiting for the other side to finish talking. It was the silence of something that was not afraid of us. And I realized, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, that in all our years of raiding, we had never encountered anything that was not afraid of us. We had no playbook for this, no protocol, no training. The Vakari Dominion had built its entire military doctrine on the assumption that fear was universal. And here was a single ship, crewed by a species we had barely studied, demonstrating that the assumption was wrong. I turned to my tactical console and ran a deeper scan on the Stellan March, and what I found made me pause. The hull composition was unusual. Standard cargo haulers used lightweight alloy plating, sufficient for micrometeorite protection and atmospheric stress, nothing more. But certain sections of this ship's hull were reading as significantly denser than anything I had seen on a civilian vessel. Layered materials, composite structures that my scanner could not fully penetrate. There were sections that returned no data at all, as if the hull was absorbing the scanner beam entirely rather than reflecting it. I flagged the anomaly and forwarded it to Sorath's display. He glanced at it, dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Reinforced plating, he said. Freighters that operate in debris fields sometimes upgrade their hulls. It means nothing. I wanted to press the point, but I did not. Sorath was the commander. He had more experience than anyone on that bridge. If he said it meant nothing, then it meant nothing. had not transmitted a surrender code. It simply hung there in the dark, its running lights blinking in a steady, unhurried rhythm, as if our 3 warships and our 60 weapons and our ultimatums were a weather pattern passing overhead, something to be endured rather than feared. Sorath's expression hardened. He was not accustomed to defiance. Defiance meant the prey did not understand its position, and it was our job to educate them. He gave the order I had heard him give a dozen times before, the order that always came when a target refused to cooperate. He told the burning wake to fire a warning volley. Low-yield kinetic rounds, aimed across the freighter's bow, close enough to rattle their hull without causing structural damage. It was a demonstration, a reminder that we could reach out and touch them whenever we chose. It had never failed to produce the desired result. Three rounds, fast and precise, streaking across the gap between our flotilla and the Stellan march. I watched them on my tactical display, bright points of light arcing toward the target on a trajectory designed to pass within meters of the freighter's forward hull. They did not pass within meters of the forward hull. They did not reach the forward hull at all. Approximately 200 meters from the Stellan march, the rounds struck something invisible, a barrier of energy that materialized an instant before impact, and swallowed the kinetic rounds like stones dropped into deep water. No explosion. No debris. No deflection. The rounds simply ceased to exist, absorbed by a shimmering lattice of light that flickered into visibility for half a second, and then vanished. My console screamed. Data flooded my display, and none of it made sense. The energy signature of that barrier did not match any known shield technology in the Vakari database. It did not match Alari shields, or Dothani barriers, or mech deflection grids. It was something else entirely, something layered and rotating and impossibly dense, and my instruments could not even calculate how much power it would take to generate a field like that, because the numbers exceeded my scanner's upper range. I ran the numbers 3 times. The result was the same each time. The shield surrounding the Stellan march was drawing more power than our entire flotilla's combined reactor output. I opened my mouth to report what I was seeing, but I never got the chance, because at that exact moment, the Stellan march began to change, and the cold feeling at the base of my spine became something I could finally name. It was fear. These were mechanical adjustments, practical and predictable, the kind of thing you accounted for in tactical planning and moved on. They were the kind of changes a ship made when it was preparing for a fight, small adaptations within known parameters. What the Stellan March did was nothing like that. Sections of the freighter's hull began to slide apart, not breaking, not rupturing, but opening, like panels designed to be opened, like doors that had been waiting to be unlocked. The movement was smooth and precise, mechanical systems that had clearly been engineered for this exact transformation, tested and maintained, and ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Beneath the dull, pitted exterior of the cargo hauler, something else was emerging. Weapon batteries, row after row of them, extending from concealed housings along the ship's flanks, its dorsal ridge, its ventral surface. Weapons I had never seen before, sleek and dark and angular, arranged in configurations that spoke of overlapping fields of fire and redundant targeting capability. My scanner tried to count them and returned a number that made my stomach drop. The Stellan March was carrying more weapon systems than our entire flotilla combined, not slightly more, not marginally more. Significantly, overwhelmingly more, the way a flood carries more water than a cup. But the weapons were not the worst part. The worst part was the energy reading. As the ship's true systems came online, its power output climbed, and kept climbing, past every threshold my instruments could measure, past the theoretical limits of the reactor technology I understood, into a range that my console could only represent as a number, followed by an error flag, because the value exceeded its display capacity. The Stellan March had been running on a fraction of its actual capability, hiding its true nature behind the energy profile of a civilian engine, the way a predator hides in tall grass. Now the mask was off, and the power coursing through that ship was staggering. Around the bridge, every officer had gone still. The laughter from minutes ago was a memory from a different lifetime. Dreven, the scanner officer, was staring at his display with his mouth open. The weapons officer, a veteran named Mecht, had his hands frozen over his firing controls, not out of hesitation, but out of something closer to paralysis. Even Sorath had gone rigid in his command chair, his eyes locked on the view screen where the Stellan March was completing its transformation. Sensor masts extended from the Stellan March's dorsal surface, tall and bristling with arrays that swept our flotilla with scanning beams, so powerful I could feel them as a vibration in my console. Additional shield emitters deployed along the hull, layering the already impenetrable barrier with secondary and tertiary fields. Engine ports that had been concealed behind false hull plates blazed to life, multiplying the ship's available thrust by a factor that made my console display another error flag. The Stellan March, which had been drifting through space like a sleeping animal, was now fully awake, and awake it was something that made our 3 warships look like toys. And then the human commander's voice came through the channel again. The same voice, the same tone, the same maddening calm. She identified the vessel's true designation, UEN Stellan March. Vanguard-class armed merchantman. United Earth Navy. She said that we had committed an act of aggression against a sovereign human vessel operating in neutral space. She informed us that we had 10 seconds to power down our weapons, shut down our engines, and prepare to be boarded. She was giving us the ultimatum. The prey was telling the predators to surrender. For a moment, the bridge was frozen. I could hear the hum of the ship's systems, the soft click of cooling fans, the sound of my own breathing. 10 seconds. She had given us 10 seconds. The same kind of countdown we had given her, but delivered without anger, without bravado, without the need to posture or threaten. It was delivered the way you might inform someone that a door was about to close, and they should step through it now if they intended to. I looked at Sorath, and I saw something I had never seen on his face before, something that did not belong there. It was uncertainty. For 3 full seconds, the greatest tactical mind in the Vakari fleet sat in his chair and did not know what to do, and those 3 seconds were the closest we came to survival, because if he had given the order to power down, if he had swallowed his pride and done what every rational calculation demanded, we would have walked away from the Argent Corridor with our lives and our ships, and nothing more than a bruised reputation. But Sorath Vel had not built his legend on retreat. He had not conquered the Dothani supply lines by flinching, and he could not, in front of his officers and his crew, surrender to a single ship, no matter what that ship had revealed itself to be. Pride is a strange thing. It can push you to achieve the impossible, and it can push you off a cliff. In that moment, standing on the bridge of the Talon of Keth, with every display showing numbers that screamed retreat, Sorath's pride chose the cliff. He stood from his chair. His voice was steady, and I will give him that much, because whatever else he was in that moment, he was not a coward. He ordered all 3 warships to open fire, everything we had, full broadside, plasma lances, kinetic batteries, torpedo spreads. The combined firepower of the Vakari Dominion's finest raiding flotilla, unleashed at once against a single target. The bridge erupted into action. Officers shouted confirmations. Weapons charged. Targeting locks engaged. The Talon of Keth shuddered as its main batteries roared to life, and through the view screen, I could see the dread silence and the burning wake doing the same, their hulls lighting up with the discharge of every weapon they carried. For one brief, blinding second, the space between our flotilla and the Stellan March was filled with fire. Plasma bolts, kinetic slugs, guided torpedoes, all of it screaming toward the human ship in a wall of destruction that should have been enough to crack a small moon. And the Stellan March did not move. It did not evade. It did not roll or bank or attempt to present a narrower profile. It sat there, vast and steady, and it took everything we threw at it. The shield lattice materialized again, brighter this time, a geometric web of interlocking energy fields that rotated and shifted with each impact, distributing force across its surface, like water flowing over stone. Our plasma bolts splashed against it and dissipated into harmless light. Our kinetic rounds struck it and vanished without leaving a mark. Our torpedoes detonated against it and accomplished nothing. Not a flicker, not a fluctuation, not a single sign that our full combined assault had caused even the smallest inconvenience. The barrage lasted 12 seconds. 12 seconds of every weapon we possessed, firing without pause. I counted them on my chronometer. 12 seconds of the most powerful attack our flotilla was capable of producing, and the result was nothing. Not reduced shields, not minor damage, not even a course correction. Nothing. The Stellan March sat behind its barrier and absorbed our fury the way a mountain absorbs rain, patiently and without comment. The silence on our bridge was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The targeting displays showed green locks across the board. Our weapons were still charged, still ready. But every officer on that bridge understood the same thing at the same moment. We had given everything, and it had not mattered. Then the Stellan March fired back. I need to describe what happened next with precision, because I need you to understand that what followed was not a battle. A battle implies 2 sides with a chance of victory. What followed was a demonstration. The humans demonstrated what they were capable of, and we learned the lesson with our ships and our crew. A beam of focused energy, blue-white and impossibly narrow, lanced from the Stellan March's forward battery and struck the burning wake along its midsection. I do not have the technical vocabulary to describe that weapon accurately because my instruments could not classify it. It was not a standard plasma lance. It was not a particle beam. It occupied a category that did not exist in our weapons taxonomy, something that cut through the burning wake's hull plating as if the plating were not there. The beam held for less than 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, it sliced the burning wake cleanly in two. The forward section separated from the aft section with a precision that was almost surgical. Atmosphere vented from the exposed decks in white plumes that crystallized instantly in the cold of space. The ship's emergency bulkheads tried to seal, but there was nothing to seal against. The cut was too clean, too complete. The burning wake's two halves drifted apart, dark and silent, trailing debris and frozen atmosphere. My scanner showed the life signs dropping to 0 within moments. 70 crew, gone in less time than it takes to speak a sentence. The dread silence tried to run. Its captain, a female named Vor Shen, was smarter than Sorath. She saw the burning wake fall and immediately ordered an emergency turn, trying to bring her engines around for a full-speed retreat. She was a good captain. Her crew responded instantly, and the dread silence was halfway through its turn within seconds, its engines flaring bright as it tried to put distance between itself and the human ship. She almost made it. The gap was widening. For a moment, it looked like the dread silence might escape. Then the Stellan March hit her with something different. A projectile, small and fast, barely visible on my tactical display, that crossed the distance between the two ships in a fraction of a second, and struck the dread silence amidships. What happened next defied every principle of physics I had been taught at the War Academy. The ship's hull did not rupture outward the way it should have from an explosive impact. Instead, it buckled inward. The metal bent and folded and collapsed, as if an invisible hand had reached inside the ship and squeezed. The dread silence crumpled from the inside out, deck by deck, section by section, its hull folding in on itself like paper crushed in a fist. I could see the structural supports bending through the view screen, could see the ship's shape distorting in real time, could hear Vor Shen's final transmission on the open channel, a single sharp breath that cut off mid-syllable as her bridge compressed around her. A ship that had served the Dominion for 9 cycles, that had flown through a dozen successful engagements, that had carried crew members who had families and homes and lives beyond the hull, crushed into a shape that no longer resembled a ship at all. 2 ships, less than 10 seconds, and the Stellan March had not moved from its position, had not adjusted its heading, had not even changed the rhythm of its blinking running lights. It had ended 2 warships the way you might brush dust from your sleeve, with a casual efficiency that suggested the act required only a fraction of its attention. Sorath was shouting. Orders, commands, anything that might change what was happening. His voice had lost its calm authority. It was raw now, stripped down to something primal, the voice of a man who had spent his entire life in control and was discovering what it felt like to have control taken away completely. He ordered an emergency warp jump, our fastest escape route, the one maneuver that could put distance between us and the human ship before they could fire again. The engine room responded instantly. I could feel the warp drive spinning up through the deck plates, That familiar vibration that meant we were seconds from tearing a hole in normal space and disappearing into it. I had never been so grateful for a vibration in my life. The vibration stopped. The warp drive went dead. Not a malfunction, not an overload, just a sudden, total cessation of power to the warp core, as if someone had reached into our engine room and turned it off. My console showed the reason immediately. The Stellan March had deployed some kind of disruption field, a sphere of interference that was suppressing our warp capability across a radius that encompassed our entire position. We were trapped in normal space, pinned in place like an insect on a collector's board. The exits were sealed. The cage was closed. Sorath ordered conventional engines to full power. If we could not jump, we would run. The Talon of Keth surged forward, its sublight drives pushing us away from the human ship at the fastest speed our engines could produce. For a moment, the gap between us widened, and I allowed myself the desperate fantasy that we might escape. That, maybe their conventional drives could not match ours. That maybe we were faster in normal space. That maybe there was still a chance. Then the Stellan March began to move, and the fantasy died. That ship, that enormous, heavy, impossible ship, accelerated with a smoothness that had no right to exist. It matched our speed within seconds, and then exceeded it, closing the gap we had opened, as if our engines were producing nothing more than a gentle breeze. It was 3 times our mass, carrying more weapons and shields and systems than we could catalog, and it was faster than us. Not marginally faster, not slightly faster, but faster in a way that made our full-speed retreat look like we were standing still. The laws of physics that I understood said a ship that large should not be able to accelerate that quickly. The Stellan March did not appear to care about the laws of physics I understood. But it did not ram us. It did not overtake us and block our path. It settled in behind us, matching our speed exactly, maintaining a constant distance, and it began to fire. Not with the ship-killing weapons it had used on the burning wake and the dread silence. With something smaller, something precise. Surgical strikes that targeted specific systems with an accuracy that bordered on artistic. Our weapons went first. Port batteries, starboard batteries, dorsal turrets, ventral mounts. One by one, each weapon system on the Talon of Keth was struck by a focused pulse that disabled it without destroying the surrounding hull. The shots were impossibly accurate. Each one struck the exact junction between a weapon mount and its power supply, severing the connection without damaging the structural integrity of the adjacent sections. Then the engines. Not destroyed, just reduced. A shot to the primary thruster assembly cut our speed by half. Another to the secondary drives cut it again. We were limping now, bleeding velocity, and the Stellan March was still behind us, still matching us, still firing those precise, measured shots that took apart our ship system by system. Each shot was a statement. Each disabled system was a sentence in a message that the humans were writing on our hull, and the message was simple. We could have ended you at any time, and we chose not to. Communications went next. Our long-range transmitter array was struck by a single pulse that melted the antenna into useless metal. Then the short-range backup. Then the emergency beacon. We were deaf and mute, cut off from the rest of the flotilla, from the Dominion, from anyone who might have heard us calling for help. alone in the dark with a ship that was taking us apart piece by piece, and doing it with a patience that was more unnerving than any show of aggression. On the bridge, chaos had given way to a terrible stillness. Officers sat at their consoles with nothing to do. Weapons were offline, engines were crippled, communications were gone, navigation was limited to emergency backups that could barely calculate a heading. We were a ship in name only, a hull full of living beings, with no means to fight, no means to flee, and no means to call for help. The bridge was dim, lit only by emergency strips along the floor, and the glow of failing displays. The main view screen was still functional, and through it, the Stellan March was visible, vast and dark and steady, holding position off our stern like a predator that had finished the chase and was simply waiting. Sorath was standing at the command console when a secondary power relay exploded 3 meters from his position. The blast threw him backward across the bridge, and he struck the deck hard. I was at his side in seconds, but I could see immediately that the injuries were severe. Shrapnel had struck him across the torso, and the impact with the deck had done further damage. He looked up at me, and that expression was on his face again, that look of pure confusion, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had no answer. He reached up and gripped my arm with surprising strength, and he said something to me. I leaned close to hear it over the alarms and the hiss of venting atmosphere. He said, "What are they?" He did not say anything else. I was the ranking officer. The Talon of Keth was mine, and it was a ship with no weapons, no engines, no communications, a fractured hull, and a crew that had watched 2 sister ships erased from existence in the time it takes to draw a breath. Of the 180 crew who had started the engagement, fewer than 40 were still alive. Many of those were injured. Life support was failing on 4 decks. The air recyclers were damaged. Temperature was dropping in the outer sections. We had hours at best before the ship became uninhabitable. I gave no orders, because there were no orders to give. I stood on the bridge of a dying ship and looked at the view screen, and the Stellan March was there, vast and patient, its running lights still blinking in that same steady, unhurried rhythm. It had stopped firing. There was nothing left to fire at. Every system worth disabling had been disabled. We were no longer a threat, and the humans, apparently, only applied force to things that were threats. They had not needed to disable us so surgically. They had the power to do far more, and far worse, and they had chosen this instead. Every shot had been deliberate. Every target had been selected. They had used exactly as much force as they deemed necessary, and not a single measure more. This was not the savagery of a species that lashed out in panic or fury. This was discipline. This was a species that knew exactly how much damage to inflict, and exactly when to stop. And that knowledge, that control, was more frightening than any weapon they carried. It took them 40 minutes to dock with us. 40 minutes during which my crew and I sat in the dim emergency lighting of a broken ship and listened to the sounds of failing systems and the breathing of wounded comrades and the silence of space pressing in through fractured hull plates. I spent those 40 minutes thinking about what I expected to happen, and what I expected was death. This was how the Vicari operated. When you defeated an enemy so completely that they could no longer pose a threat, you finished them. You did not waste resources on captives. You did not leave survivors to report your tactics. You ended it, cleanly and efficiently, and you moved on to the next target. It was pragmatic. It was the way of the predator, and I had no reason to believe humans would be any different, because every species in the galaxy operated on the same fundamental principle: the strong consumed the weak. So when the docking clamps engaged and the airlock pressurized and the seals hissed open, I stood at the head of what remained of my crew, and I prepared myself to face the end with whatever dignity I could gather. I straightened my uniform. I placed my hands behind my back. I lifted my chin. If I was going to be the last sub-commander of the Talon of Keth, I would be remembered as one who stood upright. The airlock opened. Humans came through. I had never seen a human in person before. Only images, flat recordings in intelligence briefings that failed to capture anything meaningful about them. They were smaller than us, shorter, softer, without the scaled hide and reinforced bone structure of a Vicari. They looked fragile, breakable. The kind of species you would pass in a corridor and dismiss without a second thought. Fully enclosed suits of composite plating that covered them from head to foot, angular and dark, with helmets that concealed their faces behind reflective visors. They moved in pairs, smooth and coordinated, sweeping through the airlock with their weapons raised and their footsteps perfectly synchronized. I recognized the movement pattern. It was the pattern of soldiers who had trained together so long that communication between them had become unnecessary. Each one knew where the others would be. Each one trusted the others to cover their assigned angles without being told. It was the kind of unit cohesion that took years to develop, and these humans moved with it as naturally as breathing. They secured the airlock. They secured the corridor beyond it. They moved through the ship section by section, room by room, with a speed and precision that left no gap uncovered and no shadow unchecked. They did not fire a single shot, not one. Every Vicari they encountered was ordered to place their hands in view and sit down, and every Vicari complied, because there was nothing left to fight with, and no one left to fight for. My crew watched the humans move through our ship with wide eyes and silence. The silence of people who have accepted that the situation is entirely beyond their control, and that their survival depends on the decisions of someone else. But then something happened that broke every expectation I had built over a lifetime of understanding how power worked between species. Something that confused me more profoundly than the battle itself, more than the shields, more than the weapons, more than the speed and power and impossible technology. Behind the soldiers came a second group of humans. They wore lighter armor, white and gray, with markings I did not recognize. Red crosses on their shoulders, and a symbol on their chests that I would later learn was the emblem of their medical corps. They carried cases and bags instead of weapons. They moved through the corridors the soldiers had cleared, and they began doing something that made no sense to me whatsoever. She opened her case, pulled out medical instruments, and began working on his injuries with steady, practiced hands. She spoke to him through a translation device clipped to her collar, asking him about his pain level, about his medical history, about allergies to common compounds. Her voice was gentle, patient. She did not flinch when she touched his scaled skin. She did not hesitate when she encountered physiology that must have been completely alien to her training. She cleaned his wounds and stabilized the fracture, and applied a temporary brace with a competence that said she had prepared for exactly this kind of cross-species medical emergency. When she was finished, she squeezed his arm briefly, a gesture that I later learned was a human expression of reassurance, and moved to the next wounded Vicari and did the same thing. Across the ship, more humans were doing the same. They set up improvised triage stations in cleared corridors, using portable equipment that folded out of their cases with practiced efficiency. They carried our injured on stretchers, lifting Vicari who outweighed them by significant margins, with a determination that did not seem to care about the physical difficulty. They administered fluids and pain relief and emergency care with a competence that suggested this was a standard part of their operational procedure, as if treating the wounded of a species they had just defeated in battle was as routine as maintaining their own equipment. One of the medics, a young man with steady hands and calm eyes, was working on a Vicari crew member whose burns covered most of his upper body. He applied a flexible bandage that sealed against the skin and began administering something through an injector, checking the dosage against a handheld device that appeared to be calculating the appropriate amount for Vicari physiology in real time. The whole time he worked, he was humming, a tune I did not recognize, something soft and rhythmic, and he hummed it, the way someone might hum while performing a familiar task, without thinking about it, as if saving the life of an enemy was so routine that it required only a fraction of his attention. I stood there, the ranking officer of a defeated ship. These were the same species that had cut the burning wake in half, the same species that had collapsed the dread silence from the inside, the same species that had dismantled my ship with the precision of a surgeon. And now, they were on their knees, in our corridors, healing our people. The contradiction was so enormous that my mind could not hold both realities at once. It was like trying to look at two images superimposed on each other, each one clear and sharp on its own, but impossible to reconcile into a single picture. He was taller than the others, broad across the shoulders even inside his armor, and he carried himself with the easy authority of a senior officer. He removed his helmet, and I saw a human face for the first time without a visor between us. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, eyes that were watchful but not hostile. He identified himself as Sergeant Owen Blake. He asked if I was the ranking officer. I said I was. He told me that Commander Harlow wanted to speak with me aboard the Stellan March. He said it was not an order, it was a request. But he said it in a way that made it clear the request carried the weight of everything that had just happened, and that declining it would not change the outcome of anything. I went with him, through the airlock, through a connecting corridor that smelled of recycled air and something else, something warm and organic that I later learned was called coffee, a human drink made from ground plant seeds that they consumed in remarkable quantities. Into the Stellan March, which was even more disorienting from the inside than it had been from the outside. The interior of the ship was not what I expected. A warship, even a disguised one, should feel like a warship. Metal and function, sharp edges and cold surfaces. But the Stellan March, while clearly military in its bones, had something else woven through its corridors. Small touches that served no tactical purpose. A plant growing in a container bolted to a wall, green and living, somehow surviving in the recycled atmosphere of a ship that spent its life between stars. A hand-drawn picture, taped beside an engineering panel, crude and colorful, clearly made by a child, depicting what I assumed were two human figures, standing beside a rectangular shape that might have been a house. A shelf of physical books in a common area, their spines worn from handling, titles in a script I could not read. A pair of shoes left outside a cabin door, placed neatly side by side, as though their owner intended to return shortly. These were signs of habitation, of life beyond duty, of people who lived aboard this ship, not just served on it, and who carried pieces of their personal worlds with them into the void. It was a detail that should have been irrelevant, but it unsettled me in ways I could not articulate, because it meant these humans were not simply warriors. They were people who also happened to be warriors, and there was a difference between those two things that I was only beginning to understand. Sergeant Blake led me to the bridge. It was compact, efficient, every surface covered with displays and controls that glowed with data I could not read. Officers moved between stations with quiet purpose, speaking in low voices, performing tasks that suggested the business of running the ship had already resumed. There was no celebration, no cheering, no discussion of the battle that I could see. They had moved on. The engagement was behind them, and they were already focused on whatever came next. The casualness of it was staggering. When you hear a voice over a communication channel, you build a picture in your mind. Her voice had been so calm, so controlled, that I had imagined someone large, imposing, someone whose physical presence matched the weight of her words. But Grace Harlow was average height for a human, which made her considerably shorter than me. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that were brown and unremarkable, the kind of eyes you would forget 5 minutes after looking away. Except I knew I would never forget them. Because when she looked at me, there was no hatred in those eyes, no contempt, no satisfaction in victory. There was something far more unsettling, something I could only describe as recognition, as if she saw me not as an enemy or a prisoner or a curiosity, but as a person standing in front of her, who had been through something difficult, and the weight of that recognition was heavier than any weapon she could have pointed at my chest. She offered me water. I refused. She picked up her own cup and drank from it and set it down, and the casualness of the gesture made me want to scream, because nothing about this situation was normal, and she was treating it as though it were. I asked the first question that came to my mind, the question that had been burning in me since I watched her medics kneel beside my wounded crew. I asked her why. Why were her people helping ours? We had attacked them. We had tried to seize their ship. We had opened fire with intent to destroy. By any law of any species, they had the right to let us suffer the consequences of our own choices. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, But there was no more. She said it as though it were the most obvious answer in the galaxy, as though the question itself were strange, as though the idea of letting wounded beings suffer when you had the ability to help them was so foreign to her that she could not understand why anyone would need it explained. I asked her why she had not destroyed the Talon of Keth outright. She had the firepower. She had demonstrated it twice already, decisively, irrevocably. One more shot, and we would have been debris, another cloud of frozen metal and atmosphere drifting in the corridor. She said, "A ship is not a species. Your crew did not make the decision to attack us. Your commander did. Holding every individual accountable for the choices of their leadership is not something we are interested in." I asked her if this was a strategy. If kindness was a tool humans used to control their enemies, a method of conquest, dressed in softer clothes. Because I needed it to make sense within the framework I understood. I needed there to be an angle, a calculation, a reason that fit into the world I knew. Something changed in her expression. The calm remained, but beneath it, something shifted, something old and heavy and tired. She looked away from me, toward the view screen, where the stars drifted past in silent procession, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before. She said, "We have been conquerors before. We were not impressed with who we became." She was not speaking to me as a victor to a captive. She was speaking to me as someone who had seen the worst of what power could do and had made a deliberate choice to do something different. She told me what would happen next. The survivors would be given medical treatment until they were stable. We would then be transported to the nearest neutral station with full medical support. Our weapons would be confiscated. A formal report would be filed with the Galactic Accord, documenting the engagement and the circumstances that led to it. And then we would be free to go home, free to return to the Dominion and resume our lives. I asked her what she wanted in return. Every transaction had a price. Every act of mercy came with conditions. That was how the galaxy worked. She shook her head. She said there was no price. She said that if the Vicari Dominion wanted to discuss reparations for the unprovoked attack on a human vessel, they could do so through diplomatic channels. But the survivors owed her nothing. She was letting us go because holding us served no purpose she was interested in, and because keeping prisoners required resources better spent elsewhere. I stood on the bridge of the ship that had destroyed my flotilla, speaking to the woman who had given the orders, and I felt something crack inside me. Not a bone, not a wound. Something deeper, something structural. A load-bearing belief that had held up the architecture of my entire understanding of power and strength, and what it meant to be the dominant species in a conflict. The strong crush the weak. The strong do not kneel beside the weak, and bandage their wounds and offer them water. And the fact that they could destroy us, and chose to heal us instead, was not weakness. I understood that now. Standing on their bridge, looking at the child's drawing taped to the wall, and the books on the shelf, and the shoes outside the door, it was the opposite of weakness. It was the kind of strength that came from somewhere I did not have a map for, somewhere the Vicari had never been, and perhaps could never go. I was taken to a holding area, clean, warm, with sleeping surfaces, and lighting that adjusted to our visual spectrum, as though someone had thought about our comfort before we arrived. The 6 other survivors were already there. None of us spoke for a long time. We sat in the quiet and tried to rebuild our understanding of the galaxy, and every structure we tried to erect kept falling down, because the foundation was gone. A human brought us food. It was not human food. It was a reasonable approximation of Vicari field rations, prepared with attention to our dietary requirements, seasoned in a way that suggested someone had taken the time to research what we could and could not eat. The human who delivered it was a young woman with light hair and a calm expression. She placed the food on the table between us, said something in her language that the translator rendered as, "Let me know if you need anything else," and left. The attention to detail was quietly devastating. Before I left the Stellan March, I looked back at it one final time from the transport shuttle's viewport. The concealed weapons had retracted. The sensor masts had folded away. The shield emitters were dormant. It looked like a freighter again. Dull, scarred, unremarkable. A beast of burden, trudging between stars with its cargo and its crew. As I watched, the Stellan March undocked from the station, powered up its engines, and resumed its original course. It did not linger. It did not circle back. It did not make a show of its departure. It simply turned its nose toward the dark and continued on its way, as if the engagement that had destroyed 3 warships and reshaped my entire understanding of the universe had been nothing more than a minor delay in the shipping schedule. A footnote, an interruption between one port and the next. And perhaps, to them, it was. I spent 12 days on the neutral station before a Vicari transport arrived to take me home. 12 days in which I was debriefed by station authorities, questioned by Galactic Accord observers, examined by alien physicians who had never treated Vicari before and did their best anyway. 12 days in which the certainties I had lived by continued to crumble, and new understandings took their place, strange and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. But the most important thing I did during those 12 days was not part of any official process. I did it on my own, in the quiet hours between debriefings, sitting in the station's public data access room, with a screen in front of me, and a growing sense of something I could not quite name. I researched humanity. The station's data networks contained extensive files on most galactic species, compiled by the Accord for the benefit of travelers and diplomats, and anyone else who needed to understand the beings they might encounter between the stars. Humanity's entry was one of the longest I found. I read it in fragments at first, skimming sections, looking for the tactical and technological information that a military mind would naturally seek. But the further I read, the more I found myself drawn to other sections. Sections that had nothing to do with weapons or ships or shields. Sections that described who these beings were and how they had become that way. And what I found in those records frightened me more than anything that had happened in the Argent Corridor. Because the history of humanity was a history of extraordinary contradictions. They had built civilizations of breathtaking beauty and then burned them to the ground. They had composed music that could move you across species barriers, melodies and harmonies that the station's cultural database classified as among the most emotionally complex artistic expressions in the known galaxy, and then used their same genius to build weapons capable of rendering their homeworld uninhabitable. They had written philosophies of compassion and justice and equality that were studied in academic institutions across 3 star systems, and then committed acts against their own kind that would make a Vakari raider look gentle by comparison. They had fought wars over territory, over resources, over ideas, over differences so small that an outside observer could not distinguish one faction from another. They had pushed themselves to the edge of their own extinction, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, each time clawing their way back from the brink with a stubbornness that defied rational explanation. I read about their medical history, and it was just as contradictory. They had developed cures for diseases that had ravaged their population for centuries. They had built hospitals and trained physicians, and created systems of care that extended lifespans and reduced suffering on a massive scale. And they had also developed biological agents capable of wiping out entire cities, had debated the ethics of their own medical experiments, had struggled with questions about who deserved treatment and who did not. But the direction of their history was unmistakable. Over time, slowly and imperfectly, and with many setbacks, the circle of beings they considered worthy of care had grown wider. It had started with their own families, expanded to their communities, then their nations, then their entire species, and now, apparently, it extended to alien soldiers who had attacked their ship in the dark between stars. The medic who hummed while treating my crew members' burns was not an exception. He was the product of a long, painful evolution in how an entire species defined the word neighbor. I found records of their artistic traditions, and those confused me most of all. A species capable of building weapons that could fold a warship in on itself had also produced paintings that captured light in ways my visual cortex could barely process. They had written stories that explored every facet of their nature, the noble and the terrible, with an honesty that would be considered dangerous in Vakari society. They had built instruments that produced sounds capable of triggering emotional responses in species that had never encountered a human before. Their art was not separate from their capacity for destruction. It was the other side of the same coin. The same intensity that drove them to build better weapons drove them to create more beautiful things. And they seemed to need both, as if the creating was how they survived the destroying. And through all of it, through every catastrophe and every triumph and every cycle of destruction and rebuilding, they had carried with them a set of ideas that they could never quite live up to and could never quite abandon. Mercy, justice, compassion. The belief that every individual had inherent worth, regardless of their origin or their strength or their utility to those in power. These were not ideas they had always practiced. They were ideas they had failed at, over and over, spectacularly and painfully, and then returned to, over and over, as if the failing itself was part of the process, as if each failure taught them something that brought them one step closer to becoming the species those ideas demanded they be. I found a concept in their historical records that stopped me cold: armed merchantmen. Civilian trading ships could not afford to travel undefended in those waters, so they carried hidden weapons, cannons concealed behind false hull panels, ready to be deployed if a hostile vessel approached. The practice was centuries old. It was born from necessity, from a long and painful understanding that the world was not safe, and no one else would protect you. You carried your own defense. You built your teeth into your bones and covered them with ordinary skin, and you went about your business looking like every other ship on the sea until someone made the mistake of thinking you were defenseless. It was not a special case, not a unique prototype, not an experimental vessel deployed for testing. It was a tradition, a philosophy made physical, a lesson learned in blood and salt water on a small blue planet, and carried into the stars when humanity left that planet behind. Humans built their merchant ships with hidden weapons because their entire history had taught them a single, unshakable lesson. Peace is not given, it is maintained, and the price of maintaining it is the willingness to fight for it at a moment's notice, with everything you have, and then to put the weapons away and go back to the business of living as soon as the fighting is done. They did not trust the galaxy to be kind, because they did not trust themselves to be kind, and they had the historical record to justify that distrust. But instead of becoming cynical, instead of surrendering to the darkness they knew lived inside them, they had done something remarkable. They had built systems to contain that darkness. Laws, institutions, codes of conduct, rules of engagement, principles that they argued over and revised and broke and rebuilt, all designed not to eliminate the capacity for destruction, but to control it, to channel it, to ensure that when the weapons came out, they were wielded with precision and purpose, and put away again as quickly as possible. Grace Harlow had not enjoyed destroying the burning wake and the dread silence. I understood that now, with a certainty that went beyond logic. She had not taken satisfaction in dismantling my ship. She had done it because it was necessary, because we had forced her hand, because the alternative was allowing her crew to be harmed by an aggressor who had made their intentions clear. And then she had stopped because stopping was necessary too. On the ninth day, I encountered something on the station's news feeds that added another layer to my understanding. The incident in the Argent Corridor was spreading through galactic communication channels. Other species were reacting, and their reactions were illuminating in ways that surprised me. The Ilari ambassador, when asked for comment by a galactic news service, reportedly said, "We attempted to communicate this to the Vicari through diplomatic channels on multiple occasions. They did not listen." As if that word contained the entire explanation, and no further elaboration was required. As if the word itself was a warning label that anyone paying attention should have been able to read. A MECT analyst published a brief commentary on a public forum that I read 3 times, each time understanding a little more. He wrote that the galactic community's misunderstanding of humanity stemmed from a fundamental error in classification. Most species looked at humans and saw a mid-tier civilization, technologically competent but unremarkable, socially complex but not uniquely so. They saw a species that traveled in modest ships, traded in standard goods, maintained diplomatic relations without making demands, and generally behaved as though they were content with their position in the galactic order. The error, the analyst wrote, was in assuming that a species' visible capabilities represented its actual capabilities. He pointed to several historical examples. A mech trading convoy had once been ambushed by raiders in the Gellan Expanse, and a passing human freighter had intervened. The raiders, a group of 8 armed interceptors, had been disabled in less than 90 seconds by a ship that had been registered as carrying medical supplies. A Dothani research station had suffered a catastrophic reactor failure, and the first rescue vessel to arrive had been a human deep space surveyor that happened to be passing through the sector. The surveyor had carried equipment and expertise sufficient to stabilize the reactor and evacuate the entire station crew before official rescue ships arrived. When the Dothani had asked how a survey ship carried reactor stabilization equipment, the human captain had reportedly shrugged and said, "You never know what you might run into." Humans, the analyst wrote, did not display their strength. They contained it. They walked softly through the galaxy not because they lacked the ability to walk loudly, but because they had learned, through bitter and extensive experience, that walking loudly attracted the kind of attention that led to the kind of conflicts that left everyone diminished. Their restraint was not timidity, it was strategy. It was wisdom earned at a cost that most species could not imagine. And it was, the analyst concluded, the most dangerous quality any species in the galaxy possessed, because it meant you could never be sure what you were facing until you forced their hand, and by then, it was far too late to change the outcome. I read that analysis and felt the truth of it settle into my bones like a second skeleton. We sat in the transport's passenger compartment and looked out at the stars and did not discuss what had happened, because what was there to discuss? We had all seen the same things. We had all lived through the same hours. We had all stood in the corridors of our broken ship and watched humans kneel beside our wounded and heal them. We had all breathed the same recycled air aboard the Stellan March and seen the child's drawing and the books and the shoes by the door. One of the survivors, a young engineer named Talik, spent most of the journey writing in a personal data pad. I asked him once what he was writing. He said he was trying to describe the sound the dread silence made when it collapsed, not for any official report but for himself, because he needed to put the memory into words or it would stay shapeless in his mind, and shapeless things were harder to carry than things with edges. I understood what he meant. Putting language around an experience, even a terrible one, gave it boundaries. It made it finite. It meant the experience had a beginning and an end, and could be contained within the space of a description, rather than filling every corner of your thoughts. Another survivor, an older officer named Dren, did not write or speak or look at the stars. She sat with her eyes closed for most of the journey, and when I asked if she was all right, she said she was trying to remember the exact tone of the medic's humming, the tune the young man had hummed while treating the burned crew member. She said it was the most confusing sound she had ever heard, and she wanted to hold on to it, because confusion, in her experience, usually meant she was about to learn something important. We all understood that the life we had known before the Argent Corridor was over. We were different now, changed at a level so fundamental that it felt less like a change in perspective and more like a change in species. And the dominion we were returning to, with its simple philosophies of predator and prey, strong and weak, conquer and consume, felt like a house built on sand, and we were the only ones who could feel the tide coming in. I was debriefed by the High Command. I gave my report in full, holding nothing back. I described the engagement in detail, the shield technology, the weapons, the transformation of the Stellan March from cargo hauler to warship, the boarding, the medical treatment, the conversation with Commander Harlow. I answered every question honestly and completely. I provided data from my console recordings. I offered to undergo truth verification to confirm every word. They did not believe me. Not the admirals, not the strategic analysts, not the intelligence officers. They could not believe me, because believing me would mean accepting that the Vakari Dominion was not the apex predator it had always claimed to be, and that acceptance would undermine the entire philosophical foundation on which our civilization was built. It was easier to dismiss me as a broken officer, a coward who had lost his nerve and constructed an elaborate fantasy to explain his failure. Easier and safer, and far less disruptive to the way things had always been done. My career ended. My rank was not formally stripped, but I was removed from active duty and assigned to an administrative post so minor that it did not even have a title. The other survivors received similar treatment. We were the inconvenient evidence of a truth the Dominion did not want to face, and the easiest way to handle inconvenient evidence was to bury it in forgotten offices and hope it stayed quiet. But I could not stay quiet, because somewhere out there, in the shipping lanes and the trade corridors and the empty spaces between stars, human cargo haulers were still moving, slow, ugly, unremarkable, and inside each one, behind the dull hull plating and the civilian transponder codes, there might be another Stellan March, another Commander Harlow, another set of hidden weapons and impossible shields, and medics who hummed while they healed you. And the next Vakari captain who looked at one of those ships and saw easy prey would learn the same lesson I had learned, but might not survive the learning. So I am recording this. I am putting it into words and sending it through every channel I can access, official and otherwise, to every captain and every officer and every crew member in the Vakari fleet. I do not expect to be believed. I did not believe it myself until I lived it. But I need to say it anyway, because the next crew that makes the mistake we made may not have 7 survivors to carry the warning home. Do not attack human ships, not because they will destroy you, although they will, not because their technology outmatches ours, although it does, by margins that our best engineers cannot even quantify, not because they are faster and stronger and better armed than anything we have ever encountered, although all of those things are true, and demonstrably so. Do not attack human ships because of what happens after they defeat you. Because they will defeat you, and then they will save you, and when you look into their eyes and try to understand how the same species can do both of those things, with equal skill and equal conviction, you will find an answer that will break everything you thought you knew about strength and weakness, and what it means to be powerful in this galaxy. Humans are not what we thought they were. They are not a mid-tier civilization of traders and explorers, content to haul cargo and stay out of the way. They are a species that spent its entire history at war with itself, that fought and bled and nearly perished a dozen times over, and that emerged from that long and terrible crucible not hardened but tempered. There is a difference, and it matters. Hardened things are rigid. They resist pressure until they cannot, and then they shatter. Tempered things bend. They flex. They absorb the blow and then they spring back. And they are stronger for having been struck. That is what humanity is. A species that has been struck by every blow it is possible for a civilization to endure, most of them self-inflicted, and has emerged not broken but refined. They carry their scars openly. They remember their failures. They teach their children about the worst things their ancestors did, not to glorify those things, but to ensure they are never repeated. And they have built, from the wreckage of those failures, something that the Vicari Dominion, in all its centuries of conquest, has never possessed and may never possess. They have built restraint, the ability to be powerful without being consumed by power, the willingness to fight without losing themselves in the fighting, the discipline to stop when the fighting is done and start healing, even if the beings they are healing were the ones who started the fight. It is not a weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength there is, and they earned it through more pain than I hope our species will ever have to endure. And I am asking you to understand it too, not because I want to spread fear, but because I want to prevent the next crew from learning this lesson the way I did. Through the viewport, the stars drift past, indifferent as they have always been, bright and cold and unconcerned with the small dramas that play out between the species who live among them. Somewhere out there, a human cargo ship is making its way between ports, carrying goods and crew and hidden strength. It looks ordinary. It looks unremarkable. Its running lights blink in a steady, patient rhythm, And inside its hull, people go about their lives, drinking their coffee, reading their books, looking at pictures drawn by their children, living in the spaces between the moments when the universe demands they become something else. It undocked and turned toward the dark and accelerated away, its engines glowing faintly against the black, and I stood at the viewport and watched until its lights disappeared into the distance, until there was nothing left but stars and silence and the echo of a truth I was still learning how to carry. I did not look away until it was gone. And even now, even here, in the quiet of this room with my recording device and my memories, and the weight of everything I have seen, and everything I have failed to make others see, I find myself looking out the viewport from time to time, scanning the darkness, watching for the steady blink of running lights against the stars. Not with fear, not exactly. Not the kind of fear that makes you want to hide or run or pretend the threat does not exist. With something closer to respect. The kind of respect you feel when you encounter something that is genuinely, fundamentally better than you at the thing you thought defined you, and instead of resenting it, you find yourself wondering what it would take to learn from it. What it would take to become something more than what you are. And maybe, if I am being honest with myself in a way that I have not been honest about anything else in my life, with something closer to wonder. Because I have seen what humans are. I have seen them at their most capable and their most compassionate, and I have learned that those two things are not opposites but partners, woven together so tightly that you cannot separate one from the other without destroying both. They fight like a species that has been fighting forever, and they heal like a species that has been healing just as long, and they carry both abilities inside them at all times, ready to deploy whichever one the moment demands. And I think, quietly, in the privacy of my own thoughts, that the galaxy is a stranger and more interesting place than I believed it to be, because somewhere in it, a species like that exists, a species that looked into its own darkness and said, "We see you, we know what you are, and we choose something else." A species that builds its freighters with hidden teeth and its soldiers with gentle hands. A species that will take your ship apart and then put your crew back together and offer you water and mean it. A species that remembers every terrible thing it has ever done, not as a source of pride, but as a map of the places it will never go again. That is who they are. That is what we encountered in the Argent Corridor. And that is why, when you see a human ship drifting through the dark, slow and dull and ordinary, with its running lights blinking, and its engines humming, and its hull scarred with the marks of 1,000 ordinary journeys, you should do yourself a kindness. Let it pass. I end this recording here. I have said everything I know how to say. The rest is up to you. Believe me or do not. Dismiss me or listen. But remember the name of the Stellan March. Remember what it looked like before it changed, and what it became after. Remember that the galaxy is full of things that are not what they appear to be, and that the most dangerous of those things are the ones that do not need you to know how dangerous they are. The humans have a saying. I found it in their cultural database, buried among thousands of similar phrases, and it stayed with me, because it explained everything I had experienced in a handful of words. The saying is this: speak softly, and carry a big stick. They speak very softly indeed. And their stick is bigger than anything we imagined.